call the meeting to order. This is a meeting of the Decorah Sustainability Commission. It's a public meeting, so we welcome all members of the public who are tuning in. This is an unusual meeting for us because the primary focus of this meeting will be a presentation by staff at the Woodwell Center for Climate Research out in Massachusetts. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. But for now, we need to take care of a couple orders of business. So Chad, do you want to call the roll of the commission members?
You bet. Martin Schramm.
Here.
Parker.
Here.
Leeds.
Here.
Barnes.
Here.
McNichol.
Here.
Mansfield.
Here.
Grimstead.
Here.
All present and accounted for, sir.
Great, thank you, Chad. For our guests, that's Chad Bird, the city manager, and joining us on the Zoom call this evening is the mayor of Decorah, Lorraine Borowski. Do you want to say hi, Lorraine? There you go. Okay, great. So we just need to approve the minutes of our last meeting from October 21st. Those came to the commission members via email from Chad Bird. They come moved before you, so I don't think we need a motion to put them on the table. Is there any discussion about the minutes? Hearing none, do we have a motion to approve the minutes?
Ben moves to approve.
Thank you, Ben.
Brent seconds.
Thank you, Brad. Appreciate it. Any further discussion of the minutes? Okay, great. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Okay, motion carries. Great. So the primary purpose of our meeting this evening is to receive a report from the Woodwell Climate Research Center in Massachusetts, formerly called the Woods Hole Research Center. The title of their report is Climate Change and Decorah Flood Resilience. This is a marvelous opportunity for the city of Decorah that just sort of landed in our lap. Woods Hole is one of the world's preeminent climate research centers. They do a lot of work for nation states and major cities. They have started to branch out and offer their sort of climate impact modeling services to smaller communities here in the United States. And so as they were thinking about how to roll that out and who to sort of test this with, they discussed this with ICLEI, which is an international organization that represents city governments interested in sustainability. And ICLEI worked with some other folks in our area, I think CEEE over at the University of Northern Iowa. And the next thing we know, these wonderful folks from Woodwell are contacting us and offering to do a flood resilience study for the city of Decorah. And we all know who live here how serious flooding is for us. We've had major flood events in 1983, 2008, and 2016. And those of us that know anything about climate change know that the odds of more large precipitation bursts is probably highly likely. So to have this sort of modeling work done for us by a first-rate research center is just too good to be true. We are very grateful, Dave, to you and to Dom and other staff at the Woodwell Center for putting together your presentation and for sending your report in advance. We look forward to your presentation. We'll let you control the screen and make your presentation. Hopefully we have enough time for questions at the end. I have at least one question from a colleague. We normally conclude by 6:15, but tonight, if necessary, we'll go to 6:30 Central Time. So I'll turn it over to you, Dave, and Dominic Dussault. And I don't know if you have other staff as well.
We do, and I will
quickly, I'll introduce the Woodwell Center team that is here on the call. But first of all, I want to thank you, Jim, for that introduction. Also for your partnership, for working with us and connecting us with so many of the important data sets that went into this, this work. Dom, do you want to share the screen? Thanks. Hello, everybody. Nice to see you all. I miss seeing people in person in meetings, but nice to meet you all virtually. My name is Dave McGlinchey. I'm the Chief of External Affairs at the Woodwell Climate Research Center. As Jim mentioned, we are a scientific research institute based in Falmouth, Massachusetts. We're a nonprofit. And we're here this evening because we have a program that is focused on modeling and assessing future climate risk. And we're talking about near-term climate risk kind of on a decadal scale. That work has, as Jim alluded to, traditionally, historically been focused on large private sector industry leaders. We work with them in an attempt to kind of shift the way different industries think about climate risk, and also large kind of national level governments. Recently, we launched a pilot project with our partners at ICLEI, the sustainability organization, to extend this research and this science to local governments who do not necessarily have access to this information, but who still need to make planning, zoning, infrastructure decisions that will impact the lives of so many Americans. That work was led by Dominic Dussault. My colleague Dominic Dussault is a research assistant at the center, and he's going to present the methodology and the results of that work tonight. We're also joined here on the call by two more of my colleagues, Emily Marshall and Natalie Balageron, who are part of our external affairs team. And then the senior scientist who was involved with this is Dr. Christopher Schwalm. He is, however, based in Berlin, and with the time difference, he didn't want to be speaking to you all in a sleep-deprived state. So, he endorses, he reviewed and endorses the report, and is of course happy to follow up by email if there's any questions or follow up, but couldn't join us tonight, unfortunately. So our pilot project includes climate change-driven flood risk assessments for 3 communities. The first that we did was New Paltz, New York. This is the second presentation we're making of this research, and the third will be Chelsea, Massachusetts, which is a city closer to us, right adjacent to Boston. I do want to thank ICLEI, and I'm not sure if Jesse Carpenter from ICLEI is on this call, but they're a great organization, and they strongly recommended New Paltz as a community that is thinking proactively about climate impacts and could make good use of this research. And just to clarify, I feel like maybe this was implicit in Jim's introduction, hopefully, but our project and our mission here is to provide this research for free of charge. There are climate risk firms out there who do this kind of work for a fee, but we believe fairly strongly that this science is a public good and should be publicly available. To the extent possible, there should not be communities or local governments that are making long-term decisions without this simply because of a lack of resources or capacity. So just a few quick words about who we are. Dom, could you flip the slide? We were founded in 1985 as the Woods Hole Research Center. We just changed our name this past summer in honor of our founder, George Woodwell, and also to make more clear our focus on climate change research. We were founded explicitly to study climate change, and then to deliver that to policymakers and decision makers. So we're not an academic institution. We don't want our research to sit on a shelf. We are very, no offense to academics on the call, apologies. We design and develop our research in collaboration with partners to make sure that it can be handed off and be immediately actionable. Dom, can you switch the slide, please? We have a pretty strong track record of doing exactly that. We designed and launched the UNFCCC in association with the British government in the late 80s and early 90s. Our scientists have been involved in every IPCC assessment report, and our previous director and current director were both involved in the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the Obama administration. We are a nonpartisan organization, but we have deep ties to decision makers in the federal government. But again, our pivot tonight is to think about local communities, to think about local governments, and to think about how we can provide science that really helps you become a more resilient community. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Dom to speak about this work.
Thanks, Dave. So I'm going to turn my video off just in case my internet connection gets a little shaky. So let me know if there are any issues. But so as Dave said, my name is Dominic Dussault. I'm a research assistant at the Risk Group at Woodwell Climate Research Center. And us at the Risk Group, we analyze a variety of different climate risks, climate variables. This includes wildfire, droughts, extreme heat, and in this case, extreme precipitation and flooding. Now we know, and many people know from kind of a deep scientific body of literature and observational data sets, modeling exercises, that climate change is already here. Temperatures are rising, sea levels are increasing, and as was confirmed in the most recent National Climate Assessment, extreme precipitation is intensifying across the United States. So as Jim mentioned, flooding is not new to Decorah. You've had many significant flood events, the most recent 2016, where about 8 inches of rainfall fell in the city, which is approximately a 1 in 100 year event. In 2008, the upper Iowa River reached its record flood stage. And so that was a historic flood for the community. So what we want to do in this study is not only look at those historical events and the present 100-year and 500-year floodplains, but also how that flood risk will change into the future. So there are 2 main sources of flooding that Decorah is facing. The first one, and the more commonly known one, is riverine flooding. And this simply is when water overtops the banks of a river and flows into the adjacent floodplain. And now, as many of you know, the main riverine flood risk in Decorah is the upper Iowa River. However, there are other smaller streams, rivers in the nearby areas, such as the Dry Run Creek, which does pose some riverine flood risk. The second type of flooding is pluvial flooding, and this is when a stormwater system or soils are unable to effectively drain or infiltrate rainfall, leading to ponding water, as you see in this photo. The main issue in terms of pluvial flooding in Decorah is the area surrounding the levee where culverts drain water into the upper Iowa River. During times of high water levels, those culverts shut off and rainfall is unable to drain into the river, leading to ponded water behind the levee. Now, for this study, we decided to solely focus on riverine flooding in terms of the upper Iowa River. And so we're just going to look at how riverine flood risk, what that looks like today and how that will change into the future. So before I get into the results, I want to briefly go over the flood model methodology, how we build our flood model, and what inputs go into it. So the first input, and arguably the most important, is elevation data. We take high resolution, high accuracy LiDAR data around 7 meters. We use that as our base to our flood model. The second input is streamflow data, which we take from the nearby US Geological Survey stream gauge. And so we take as the entire record of historical annual maximum of streamflow events, and we calculate our 100-year and 500-year values from that data. The third input are the infiltration rates in the nearby floodplain, and we take this data from, again, the USGS and their soil database, and we assign infiltration rates depending on what hydrologic group the specific soil is associated with. And finally, land friction values. These are specific values that are assigned to different land covers. And we want to include this into our flood model because when water goes into the adjacent floodplain, the land cover affects how that water will flow. And so we want to incorporate that phenomenon into our flood model. So once we have all of the inputs, we put them into our flood model, LizFlood FP. We use this model because it's extensively peer reviewed and validated against many different historical flood events. And we run the flood model for 24 hours, and we get three different outputs. The first is flood extent. So this shows how far into the floodplain the riverine flood event reaches, the different flood depths for our entire grid. And finally, we can look at how the flood progresses throughout the 24 hours by looking at specific 20-hour intervals and seeing what parts of the city are affected when during that flood event. So before I get into the results, I do want to mention that Decorah, from what we've seen in our flood modeling, is relatively well prepared for the current and future flood events in terms of, but this is mainly because of the levee system in place. And we go into an additional levee analysis at the end of the study. So you'll see how significant the levee system is to Decorah, as I'm sure many of you know. So I first want to touch on the present flood risk in Decorah. So there's a lot going on in this slide. So I'll first start with how Woodwell, our flood extents compare to FEMA's. So generally what we find is that the FEMA flood maps are generally, sometimes they don't incorporate all the data available. And this is because when they do an update of the different flood studies, they don't always do a comprehensive update. They only update certain portions of the flood study. And an important example of this is if you look to the bottom right corner, there's a table that shows the different streamflow inputs that were used for FEMA and our flood model, and for the 100-year and 500-year events. Now you can see there's a significant increase when you look at compared to Woodwell and FEMA in terms of the cubic feet per second. And this is because FEMA's flood map was based on a 2008 USGS study that was published before the historic 2008 flood event. And so these stream flow values that FEMA uses don't incorporate that magnitude of events, and so are much lower than what we've calculated in this study. FEMA also doesn't incorporate future flood risk. They're only kind of backward looking, and this is important in terms of building and planning decisions where infrastructure that's going to be used for 50 years or more, if that's in a future floodplain, that's an important information to know when you're building it. And so finally, in order to kind of show how FEMA and Woodwell flood models compare when the same inputs are used to kind of generate some validity to our method here. So what this map is showing is the Decorah City Decorah City limits, and also the two flood extents, one for FEMA and also the other one for Woodwell. And again, these are using the same streamflow inputs. So it's not the different inputs you see at the bottom of the screen. And we do this to show how our method compares to FEMA when we use similar inputs, given that FEMA's flood maps are very well known and they're generally accepted in the community. And we want to show that our flood model is just as good and sometimes even better than the FEMA flood model. Now, the main differences that you'll see is kind of in the Freeport area, where you have this arc of extended floodplain. But besides that, the flood maps agree extremely well. And lastly, at the end, as I mentioned, we have a separate levee analysis, but we did find a possible error in terms of the Luther College berm not being included in the FEMA flood insurance study, which what we think it puts the Luther College campus and certain buildings into the 100-year floodplain when we think that they should be outside the 100-year floodplain. So now to go into the future flood risk, we first have to calculate the future rainfall and future stream flow inputs in order to use those as following inputs into our flood model. And so what we use is a regional climate model data to calculate how extreme rainfall will change in the future. And we use a hydrologic river reach model that was done by other other authors in a separate institution, and we combine those into analyzing how the probability of these extreme events will change into the future. So the first table here shows the future return period of a rainfall event for 2 future periods, and for the 100-year and 500-year event, with the baseline being 2001 to 2020. Now, the first future period is 2041 and 2060, and this represents the mid 21st century. And the later period, 2071 and 2090, represents the late 21st century. And while this seems rather far off, we like to show this time period because it's representative of how long infrastructure built today will be used in the future. So the design lifetime of much of the infrastructure is 50 years, but often they're used for longer periods than that. And so it's important to know how flood risk will change that far into the future, as I mentioned previously. So the first thing that this table shows is the future return period. So the 100-year becomes the 1 in 28-year event by mid-century, and the 1 in 18-year event by 2071 and 2090. The second number below that shows the probability of this event occurring at least once in a 30-year period. Now, we like to show this metric because we think it gives a better indication of flood risk for a particular structure, given that it only takes one flood to significantly damage a building and cause the need for serious repairs. And so the 100-year event, so the 1 in 100-year event has a 26% chance of occurring in a 30-year period. Now, if we go into the future, as it becomes a 1 in 28-year event, that probability increases to a 66% chance. And further into the future, it becomes an 82% chance. So these are significant increases into the probability. Now, for stream flow, this shows, again, the future return period, but also the change in probability for that 30-year period. Now, you'll notice that the changes aren't exactly the same in terms of rainfall and stream flow. For example, there is some intensification in terms of mid-century for the stream flow values, but as you go into the late 21st century, the event actually becomes more rare. And one hypothesis for this is because of a decrease in snowpack. And so what happens is, as we go further into the future, as temperatures rise, more precipitation falls as rainfall instead of snow. And so kind of those late spring, early summer flood events don't really happen as often because that runoff from snowmelt isn't occurring as much as it did in the past. We also use 2 different data sets, 2 different models for rainfall and stream flow. And so that also is probably adds to some of the uncertainty in terms of how these 2 variables are somewhat different in terms of the intensification into the future. And so to give an overall idea of how flood risk changes into the future, we provide 2 different metrics here. The first is the % change in flood area. As you can see, there's relatively little change. There's less than 1% for the 100-year by the mid-century, and it slightly decreases by the late 21st century. And this is mainly because the levee system in Decorah keeps the floodplain kind of contracted. It doesn't really let it extend outside. And also because the topography is quite steep, as many of you know. So the floodplain really doesn't extend very much. You need kind of significantly much more water flowing through the upper Iowa River for the floodplain to increase significantly. And the second metric is the change in average water depth. Again, we see some changes, for example, 1/4 of a foot by mid-century for the 100-year event, which is not insignificant at all. And you see kind of even fewer changes, even smaller changes, excuse me, by the late 21st century. Now, again, as I mentioned, these decreases are likely due to snowpack, decreasing snowpack as we go into the future. But also, this is just one picture of total climate risk for Decorah. Flooding is just one variable, and so there are other issues, for example, drought, extreme heat, that could affect Decorah, but were not analyzed in this study. And finally, in terms of overall flood risk in the overall domain, we look at how different structures are affected, or the number of structures that are affected for the two extreme events, 100-year and 500-year, and how that changes from the historical to the future. So we see about a 5 structure increase for the 100-year event through mid-century, and a slightly decreasing number as we go into the late 21st century, again, because of the decreasing snowpack. And so those give an overall view of flood risk in Decorah and how it will change. But I also want to show several maps that I think better visualize how flood risk changes. And these maps show the change in percent depth of water depth for these 100-year and 500-year events. So this first map shows the change in depth for the mid-century, 2041 and 2060, compared to the historical, 2001 to 2020. And you'll see that within the floodplain, you've pretty significant increases, more than 5% in many areas. You have significant flood risk along the Valley View Drive area and the Freeport area. And also want to mention that the, I believe it's Interstate Power and Light, the substation, which is located very close to the Upper Iowa Speedway, does get underwater in the 500-year event. So as we flip to the 500-year event, it does become slightly underwater. And I want to highlight that because it is a significant piece of infrastructure in terms of for Decorah. So it is an important point to note. Now, if I flip back to the late 21st century for the 100-year flood, you'll see that the percent depths actually decrease for much of the area, not by much, but it does occur. And then for the 500-year event, in terms of the mid-century changes, we again see similar changes compared to the 100-year event. You see much more flooding in the Freeport area. Valley View Drive gets much more water depths in those areas. But again, as I said, the floodplain really gets contained by the levee system and also the steep topography in the area. So it's really those minor kind of inlets of the floodplain, especially the Freeport area and some of the where the tributaries reach the Upper Iowa River, where you really have an increase in flood extent. And here again, you have the late century 500-year flood. As we saw for the 100-year, there are decreases in water depth and much more significant decreases than the 100-year event. So hopefully this there might be certain weak points along the levee, and see if certain parts of the levee weren't incorporated into the FEMA flood insurance study. And so what this map shows is the two main levee systems in Decorah. The first one I'll point out in the kind of western part of the map is the Luther College levee in Berm. So this extends from Dike Road, where you have the orange dots, and then up to the berm where it intersects with Pole Line Road. The other levee system is the Upper Iowa River levee system that goes through the main part of town. So it starts where you see that number 10 of the purple dots and goes all the way to the kind of near the Good Times Grill area where you reach 153. And then again, you have the levee that goes on the right bank that protects the school district, near the Upper Iowa Speedway, and so forth. So these numbers actually are significant for two figures that I'll show in the next slide, and they correspond to different levee IDs. This is what I'm going to show is the profile of certain levee IDs. So what we're seeing here is, as I just mentioned, the levee IDs on the x-axis for this is the left and right bank of the Upper Iowa River. And this shows the 100-year flood level, which is the blue line, and the 500-year flood level, which is the yellow line. So this is in terms of feet corresponding to the datum of the national North America vertical datum of 1988. And I've put several different landmarks so you can see how from upstream to downstream, so you can see where in terms of levee IDs intersect with those landmarks. Now, we've identified one location on both levees that are certain weak points that we want to highlight, and that is along the College Drive bridge there. So on the left bank, you have that bridge, goes down slightly in elevation, and so that allows for the 500-year level to get relatively close to the top of the levee. So you only have about 0.4 feet of difference. In the right bank, there's even less of a buffer, only 0.12 feet of difference. And so these are significant portions of the levee system that might be at risk in the future as the 500-year level changes through mid-century. But for overall, the levee system provides a significant buffer for the 500-year event. It's mainly these 2 points. Other than that, there's usually a couple, 3 feet of difference. Now I know that there is some emergency management planning where sandbags are added to these locations. And that's an important idea to focus on because how close these extreme water levels are to the top of the levee. And finally, we look at the Luther College Dike Road berm. Now, the FEMA map shows the 100-year, which is again the blue, to be above the levee system here, the Luther College and Dike Road levee and berm. And so this indicates that the FEMA flood insurance study didn't incorporate this berm into their study. And so we think it puts the Luther College campus into the 100-year floodplain when it shouldn't. Now, while the Luther College berm does protect it against the 100-year floodplain, as we've shown in this study, we also show that it doesn't protect against the 500-year flood level. And so that's another thing to consider, that there is a threshold at which in between the 100-year and 500-year, where the levee will overtop. Now, finally, I want to mention that we do assume that the levee systems for Decorah in our flood modeling efforts, that they operate as designed. And what we mean by that is there's no breach in the levee system. There's no hole that forms during a extreme flood event. There's no collapse. And this is important because it's extremely hard to model that phenomenon. It requires some surveying, extensive engineering work to understand the structural integrity of the levee, as the U.S. Army Corps does this. And so I highlight that because the levee system is really crucial, as many of you know, to protecting Decorah against these riverine flood events. And the preparation of Decorah almost relies entirely on the levee system. So the fact is that these levee systems need to be maintained as the years to come. And finally, flooding is really only one variable in terms of overall climate risk. Drought, extreme heat, as I mentioned before, these are other impacts that could affect Decorah and may have worse impacts than we saw here in terms of the flood risk. And so while it's good to understand one variable, we do want to highlight the fact that there's a host of climate risks that could affect Decorah. But with that, we're going to leave this slide, these PowerPoint with you, and so that's why there's so much text here. But with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Dom. That's terrific. I'm sure folks do have questions. Just trying to get my thing to work so I can see everybody. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to. Oh, there we go. Okay. So if you have a question, turn on your screen and raise your hand. I can call on you, or use the reaction buttons down below to indicate that you have a question.
And maybe Dom, if you unshare the content, then it would be easier to see the full. There we go.
Yep. So who has questions? Phil?
Dominic, if we were looking at that table 4 that shows the percent change in flood area and then the change in average water depth, could we, I know some of those vulnerable areas, like the Brunings area and the interstate substation and such, could we look at their elevation and basically add that to understand their potential impact from water? Because I think getting a sense of the vulnerability of the places not protected by the levee is really important.
Right. Yeah. And so, correct me if I'm not answering the question correctly, but so you're asking if we can add that value in the table to the elevations at those locations?
Yeah, if we want to get a sense of what would be happening in those 2 different time frames in the future.
Oh, okay. So I think actually a better assessment would probably be to look at the actual geospatial files that we can provide and look at those specific locations and look at the water depth at those specific locations, because again, those are average values. And so you're not going to see the granularity if you just add, as you say, the values in those tables. So, we're more than happy to provide the geospatial files so you can really look at specific locations around the city.
That's wonderful. Thanks.
Phil, do you want to pose your question?
Yeah, I guess I failed to unmute before.
Yeah.
And maybe this is related to Michelle's question, but there's been recent work on the Luther Dike and Berm system to raise them up, I believe, just in this past year. I'm just
Right.
curious if that was incorporated into the map that was showed.
That was, yes. Jim was kind enough to provide the plans for those. So I believe in the last update was in 2019. And so I do have a document of the Dike Road raise in terms of the new elevations. And then another document shows the berm, which I don't believe has been raised recently. I think in 2012, you probably know better than me, but whatever documents we were given, we incorporated into the flood study to make it as accurate as possible.
Okay, thanks.
And before the next question, I'll just say we'll send the geospatial files that Dom mentioned to Jim. So Jim, you can forward those to whoever needs them.
Sure. Well, what I'll probably do is make sure our city manager has them and our city engineer, and they'll probably be filed with the Sustainability Commission documents in our Google Drive, so they stay in the city's property. Okay. Yeah, Dean Thompson was going to ask a question, but I think that just answered it. Other questions for Dom and the team?
Would it be possible for us to do the modeling for the basin flooding as well? Could you give us the data so we could understand that? The riverine flooding was very informative, but I'm also curious about the effects on dry run as well.
Yeah, we're happy to provide the elevation data, infiltration rates that we've gathered across the study.
Would those be the only variables in the sort of internal flooding within the bowl?
Yeah, I guess also rainfall, obviously. So, I mean, it depends on what model you're using, right? So if it's simply a hydraulic model, you're just going to be inputting stream flow at the boundary. But if it's a more hydraulic model, you're going to incorporate more variables: infiltration, elevation, rainfall. So I guess it depends on what flood modeling framework you're using.
Jim, Dominic, thank you. This is fantastic. Can I just get a really quick clarification about what you said in terms of what was included for the Luther portion of that? You said that the Dike Road improvements were included, but you said the levee improvements, you didn't have that to include. Is that right? Because that just happened this past year.
So the Dike Road, I believe that is the levee. Correct me if I'm wrong. I guess I'm referring to it as the levee. So the Dike Road is the levee itself, and then the levee turns into a berm as you move north, and then it intersects with Pole Line Road. So though the improvement that happened last year to Dike Road, which is as again the levee, that was incorporated, as well as the berm data that was shared with us.
So the berm improvements were included. Okay, I just wanted a clarification on that as well.
I can share actually the the documents that were given to us, so you actually know what improvements were made in terms of what was incorporated into the flood study. So that way there is no, I guess, miscommunication on it.
Great, thank you.
We had a question in the chat, Jim. I don't know if you saw it.
Yeah, no, I see that. I can hear someone trying to pose a question and very faint in the.
I'm wondering if it's Paul.
Paul Matson. Paul, can you hear me? Do you want to pose your question, or would you prefer I pose it?
In the chat, he's asking you to go ahead.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah, so Paul is a colleague of ours at Luther College. He says, as Luther and the city of Decorah continue to develop / maintain the levels of their dikes, what is the impact or the sensitivity changes on the flooding downstream? Is there tension between what Luther and the city of Decorah does to control flooding and what happens in Freeport? By the way, I just want to add that I'm very grateful to Woodwell, because when we talked about the scope of their study, I encouraged them to extend it beyond the municipal borders of the city of Decorah and to include Freeport, because obviously that's been a major area for flooding. And so we're very grateful that they have done that. So Dom, do you understand the question?
Yes, so this really depends on where the levee's being raised. For example, if it's a Luther College levee that's being raised, it won't affect the flood levels very much, because the amount of floodplain that will absorb any flood levels in the Luther College campus isn't very big. So it can't actually it can't hold that much water. So it won't affect downstream very much what the water levels will be. Now, if it's the Upper Iowa River levee system, the one that, in downtown, as you raise those further and further up, that's going to have a bigger impact. But you can actually, it won't change very much, because in terms of what it matters what level, I guess, what extreme event you're looking at. So if it's the 100-year event, the levee system is well equipped to protect against that event. And so where in Freeport will flood from the 100-year event. If you look at, for example, the 1,000-year event, which if Decorah decides to upgrade their levee system to that level of event, that's going to affect Freeport much, much greater. So I guess to conclude, it matters what extreme event you're looking at, and it matters how much Decorah, in terms of its Upper Iowa River levee system, how much they raise it. Hopefully that gave the answer to the question.
Thanks, Tom.
Now, it's my assumption that the Luther levees that were reconstructed, or I should say the berms, did not change the amount of space in the waterway, in the floodway. Is that true?
That's from looking at the flood maps, that I would agree with that statement. As I said, the floodplain, the campus in Luther College can't hold that much water. And so if you take that away from the floodplain and the where the river can flow, it's not going to increase the river very much. And also the steep topography of Decorah in the surrounding area makes it harder for water levels to rise incrementally as you add more water into the system. So because it's such a steep watershed, you need a much more stream flow for the water levels to rise. It's almost a kind of logarithmic relationship, where as you go further and further out into the extreme stream flow amounts, you need kind of significantly more water to raise the same amount interval of river stage.
Question from Dean Thompson. The 2008 flood radically changed the channel of the upper Iowa, yet part of the modeling involves LIDAR that predates 2008. Any speculation about how a new LIDAR coverage of the valley might change your model and projection of effects?
That's a great question. And I suspect that if we use newer LIDAR, it would have an impact. And also, if you do newer surveys of the upper Iowa River in terms of the bathymetry and how deep it is in certain locations, the 2008 flood must have changed kind of the channel significantly. And so not only the surrounding floodplain, but also the channel itself, if more updated information on that would probably change the flood maps. However, because the topography is quite steep in the area, I don't expect it to change very much. There might be certain locations where you have where the floodplain is lower. For example, the Freeport area, that area might have changes in the flood extent, but other areas where it's really more of a steep valley, I don't expect the flood extent to change as much.
Well, I just say that the Freeport area is of concern. Yes, indeed.
Yeah. And they're outside of the city limits. And so, I mean, I don't know how their interests are best represented. Larry, it looks like you have a question.
Yeah. So the substation doesn't have a dike system to protect it. Is that pretty unusual for a community to have its main substation not protected by a dike system, similar to Decorah? Yeah.
Not at all. Actually, I'll give you a good example. In New York City in 2012, Hurricane Sandy flooded the substation in Lower Manhattan, and nobody thought to protect it, even though it was in the floodplain. People knew it was in the floodplain. So it's really not unusual for critical infrastructure to be in the present known 100-year floodplain. It's just a matter of sometimes funds, being able to relocate it, or not even knowing that the floodplain existed. It's very different community to community, but it's not uncommon for critical infrastructure to be in the floodplain, unfortunately.
This is Jim. I'm a little surprised that the College Drive Bridge is a potential weak point. You would think that when they built the bridge, they would have, built it high enough that that wasn't going to be a possibility. I don't know. I mean, it sounds like our only solution there is to sandbag around it or near it.
Right. I mean, again, it depends on if you do want to raise the levee, to what level you want to protect against. Given that it takes a significant amount of funds to raise a levee, it might be worth it to go as high as possible without, with community input, of course. But because it just takes so much money and effort to raise a levee system. Preparing for sometimes the worst is the better choice.
I see in the chat we have another question from Ross Hadley, who's a member of the City Council. He says, Dom, do you have other flood mitigation ideas, for example, pump locations or dike additions for Decorah?
So in terms of pump locations, this is important for the pluvial flood risk that I mentioned earlier. Unfortunately, in the study, we didn't have the opportunity to model that behind the levee system. So where those culverts intersect with the upper Iowa River. But that I do know that there are some pump systems in that area. And so being aware and having backups, raising those pumps are important resilience measures for that pluvial flooding. In terms of the more riverine risks, such as dike additions, it might be better actually to look at areas where you can design them to be flooded. So for example, open space, conservation area, picking locations of a community that the water can flow without having significant damage to structures, to buildings, but letting nature run its course where its water is flowing into a wetland or a park that can absorb that extra water without having harmful effects to the community. And so making those design choices are actually sometimes better than dike additions, where that actually can increase water levels for other parts of the community, such as Freeport, but also in that area itself, given that you're just decreasing the size of the channel. I believe that if you look at historical maps, the downtown area of Decorah was actually, is actually in the floodplain before Dry Run Creek was diverted into Upper Iowa River. And so, changing that topography into a narrow channel, that does significantly raise the water level. So if we look at it from a different perspective, where you can choose where the water will flow and not have such a damaging effect, or the risk really goes down for those levee systems, because you're just reducing the amount of water in the system. You're letting the system work as it's designed to.
Could I just add very quickly, Jim? So first of all, we intend to continue to be a resource, and Dom can answer any question, as you can tell. So we're standing by on any follow-ups. But ICLEI also has indicated we share this research with them, and you all are a member of the ICLEI network, and Jesse Carpentier is going to follow up and intends to be a resource on any kind of best practice next steps that might come directly out of this study.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. That's welcome news. I guess I have a question about the Valley View Drive area. And I wonder, Dom, if you could maybe put that back up for us to look at. It seemed like that's an area that's quite at risk.
Sure, yeah. That's actually an interesting story that you point out. So the Valley View Drive area, hopefully you can see my mouse.
Yes.
So actually this is a levee system, but it doesn't really hold against the 100-year event.
Yeah.
There's actually where the kind of road intersects right here in the kind of southern part of Valley View Drive at the end, there's actually a low elevation point, which water is, it allows the water to drain into that ditch more or less. And so that actually is, if it is raised a little bit and you address that smaller low elevation area, the southern part of it, you could hold it against the 100-year event. But at the moment, it is in significant flood risk area.
Thank you. Any other questions about the Valley View Drive area? just oscillating back and forth between the screens here.
I have a separate question, Jim.
Yes, Phil, yeah.
So in 2018, the Iowa Flood Center did a study or did some modeling for us of our area. I was wondering if you received that modeling, those modeling results, and if so, had a chance to compare them to what you obtained.
Yes, I believe that they did a study to understand how the updated levee systems in terms of Luther College would affect the Freeport area. And they mainly used actually the 2008 USGS flood study. So I don't think they did an update in terms of the inputs. So it's actually very similar to what what I showed in comparing the FEMA maps. They're very similar just because their inputs didn't really change. It's only that the Luther College levee was slightly raised, and so it decreased the floodplain a small amount, which in fact, from the results showed that there wasn't really an increase in terms of flood risk downstream. But overall, it was very similar to what we found.
Okay.
Ben, so it sounds like, you know, we're thinking there might be more 100 and 500 year flood events. We've got this levee system, which is a really effective tool to protect our community. I should know this, but how often is that levee system checked or certified to make sure that it's in as good a condition as it can be? That would seem important.
Yeah, I'll kind of touch on that, Ben. So I've been here just a little over 9 years, and it's been recertified once in that time frame. We started a certification process. Actually, it was underway when I arrived in Decorah 2011, 2012. And my understanding is it had been quite some time prior to that, if at all, in terms of a certification process with the Army Corps of Engineers. I know they really ramped up their inspections and certifications. They basically started paying attention to these types of structures after Katrina down in the Gulf. And there were a lot of changes that they really made the city go through to prove the levee system. And part of that we're seeing now with the new firm maps. That's really kind of part of that process as well, because the Army Corps and FEMA required that the city do pump modeling to show that we can handle the pumping in the ponding areas when the floodgates actually close, which is the interior flooding as part of the structure. So we are recertified or accredited. That happened in 2016, 2017, I think, something like that. But as part of that process, again, for the last 10 or 12 years, the Army Corps actually steps foot on the levees with a eyes on the ground inspection, and then they provide reports to us as to things that are acceptable or minimally acceptable or not acceptable, and we need to correct those things within a certain period of time. So now the process is annual.
Thanks, Jeb. Other questions? Molly?
I actually have one question going back to the slide that Jim just had you pull up. I was sort of interested in the extent of the flooding and projected north of the Walmart area that's floodplain. That looks like that's all in like dark red. So if there were potential plans to sort of raise some of that out of the floodplain, or there would be a possibility of that actually then increasing the other areas around it, particularly downstream in Freeport, is that right?
Yes, it would increase it. By how much? I'm not sure.
Okay.
But it would increase it.
Okay. And I would ask a follow-up question too, is a lot of certification goes by the FEMA maps because they're the federal maps. And then have you guys had questions where your maps are different? And then people come in and want to use your maps because they show projections into the future compared to the past. And it's not a question of holding up, but it is interesting that if we're thinking about future and projections, those might be different than what the FEMA map shows in terms of sort of changes to land use within the floodplain. So I guess it's not a question, it's a little bit more of a statement. I'd be interested to know how that would stand up.
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, there are often differences in our flood maps, sometimes just because of methodology differences. For example, in other communities, we've had the opportunity to look at pluvial flood risk, and that's kind of shown that many small streams that FEMA doesn't look at do have significant flood risk, especially if you have smaller communities that are lined up against those streams. They aren't really included in the FEMA flood maps because of that. And so that's one big difference. And again, also that they're only historical looking and not future looking. Now, I'm not sure on what the certification process is for a flood map in terms of FEMA. There is some contracting that they do and certain standards that they have to go by because of federal regulations. So I'm not sure on that process in terms of, taking a map and then making it into a 100-year FEMA authorized, I guess you could say, map.
This is Dean Thompson again. Regarding Valley View Drive, in addition to the question about the elevation of the road, the, I don't know, 10 or 20 acres of the field toward the river in the last 10 years has changed from cropland to tree planting. I don't know if it was CRP, CSP, WEQ, I don't know the program, but that will change significantly how the water moves in this area being around my house.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a good question about Valley View Drive. And in fact, just to make a personal point, I worry a little bit, I worry a lot actually, about the effect of the change in elevation of the Luther Dike Road berm, whatever, on my property, which is just, quarter mile to the south. So I don't think that's much of a question, but it's a comment. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Dean. Do others have questions? Yeah, Michelle, looks like you have one.
I just keep thinking about the areas that are along dry run, areas that have overflow, and we see study like by Hively Street, by McDonald's and stuff. So places that weren't analyzed in the study, and I think we see those issue areas on like an annual basis with larger storms. Can you just give us like the layman's version of like how to begin to tackle that pluvial analysis of that pluvial flooding? And again, what data sets you could provide to us to help with that?
Sure. So the U.S. Geological Survey has a very useful tool called Stream Stats, where it basically allows you to click on any point in a river system in Iowa, and actually many states, and estimate the 100-year, 500-year stream flow based on regression equations that they've created. And so it's a very useful to get an idea of places that don't have gauges, stream gauges. It's very useful to get an understanding of the stream flow, the 100-year, 500-year stream flows in those locations. So that's one way of understanding flood risk. Is you can look at how much water is going through the system at certain locations. Beyond that, you need slightly more sophisticated modeling systems where you use that in use that input into some sort of model that gives you an idea of the flood extent. There is a way to do kind of a back of the envelope calculation where you can try to figure out how much area a river channel, for example, the Dry Run Creek, how much water it can hold. And then at what point does that channel not hold any more water, and you can see how much excess water you have in it and how much water goes into the floodplain. But to really know specifically where water will flow, you would need a more sophisticated modeling system, unfortunately. Hopefully that helps.
Thanks, Tom. Dom, I have a question from a colleague, and I think you may have answered it earlier. This is from Laura Peterson at Luther. And it comes back to this, the decreased risk later in the century. So she says, the result that the frequency of heavy precipitation events could increase so much by the end of the century, while simultaneously the frequency of flooding events actually decreases, is somewhat perplexing. The report suggests this could be due to lower snowfall amounts, reducing the potential for stream flow peaks during spring melting. Is this result something that is seen in other locations as well? How high is your confidence in this result?
It's a great question. So as you mentioned, I did touch on this before. So it's also not only just probably because of the snowpack, but because we use different data sets to analyze rainfall and stream flow into the future. It's just one of the natures of modeling. You have to combine different data sets. And also, when rainfall goes into a system, there are some other phenomena that happen for it to become runoff, infiltration, land use, all these different elements before it becomes stream flow. So it is very understandable where you have cases where rainfall increases in intensity and that leads to increasing stream flow and intensity. But there are also other cases, and this has been found across the world, where increases in intensity in rainfall don't always equate with increases in stream flow. And this was found in kind of a global study. They looked at kind of a global, they used a global stream flow model to look at where stream flow will change in the future in terms of intensity. And they found that many areas, for example, in Japan, where there is a very steep topography as well, and it goes from mountains to coastal floodplain very quickly, the flood risk actually didn't increase as much, and it actually decreased in terms of the stream flow. It didn't intensify at all, where the rainfall did intensify. And so there are other cases where this has happened. And so while it is a little, I'll admit, perplexing, and sometimes we don't always have the answer specifically why we get these results, there are documented cases, and we can use those other cases to inform how we think about other areas that we find this happening. But in terms of the confidence, we're fairly confident in terms of how these values will change. The models that we're using have been validated, and we actually use a method where sometimes the values themselves, for example, the stream flow amount, might not be exactly the historical amount that has been found. And so that's usually called what we call a bias in the model product. But to correct for that, we use a methodology that looks actually at the probability change instead of comparing actual amounts. And so this kind of allows us to bypass that bias problem. And so we're fairly confident in the result, but I'll admit that sometimes, the result is a little bit perplexing. But there are locations where it has been validated before.
Thanks, Tom. Other questions?
This is Phil Iverson again. I have a more technical question. Your model produces predictions of water depth and extent, et cetera. Do those predictions come with measures of uncertainty, say in a statistical sense?
the depths and extent don't come with uncertainty because there are specific values, but there is uncertainty in terms of the inputs that go into it. For example, the 100-year amount, that is an estimate based on a statistical relationship that we estimate with historical data. Where we fit a probability density function to the data to estimate what we think is the 100-year amount. Now, there is obviously some error in that. It's not a perfect fit. And so there is uncertainty in terms of the inputs, but the actual values themselves, because we only put one value in them, in the flood model, we don't have the uncertainty associated with the flood extent and flood depth. Now, if you put, for example, a couple of standard deviations away from the 100-year extent, if you use that as your input into the flood model, you would be able to approximate an uncertainty bound based on those, if you use that methodology.
Yeah, that's something I would be interested in seeing if you've done it or could do it.
We could do it. We haven't done it just because of the timeline and scope of the study didn't allow us to go that far deep into the statistical uncertainty. But it is a great question, and often an issue found in the literature where we're trying to get the best estimate of an extreme value when you're using a short amount of data. And that's often something that's many scientists have struggled with, is estimating extreme values when you only have, say, 30 years of data.
Mayor Borowski, did you have a question?
I don't have a question, but I wanted to make sure that I made a comment on behalf of the city in appreciation for the detailed work and the information that you provided to the city. I've been in a lot of listening discussions, way back, and where such a type of data that you presented would have been very valuable to have, and to be able to such an organization as the Woodwell Climate Center be able to work for Decorah. I just wanted to pass on how much I appreciated the work that you put forth and what this can be used for in the future.
Amen.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Go ahead, Dave.
No, I was just saying thank you, but I do want to add one kind of, or reiterate one top line message here. So Dom said, and I'll say again, ultimately when you consider climate change, resiliency, there's a suite of variables that you should be thinking about. But I've seen Dom and the risk team do assessments of cities, geographies all over the world, and I don't recall one where the top line message was, you're actually really well prepared. There's nuances, there's areas that need focus. But my takeaway when Dom sent this report over and I read through it a week ago was you guys are really well prepared, comparatively to other communities. So I think there's a good news message here.
That's exactly right.
I think that's true for Decorah. I'm not so sure that's true for Freeport. Yeah, this is
Dean once. I'm sorry, it's Dean once more. We're looking right now at the impact of flooding in the Decorah area. When it rains very hard and very long, the first thing I do is look at the hydrographs from the USGS, beginning in Lime Springs down to Kendallville and Bluffton. And so one thought I might leave with is part of our defense, shall we say, is to encourage soil conservation practices in areas of the upper Iowa watershed, in Winnebago County and in Howard, and certainly up in Minnesota. Those practices that are designed specifically to reduce runoff, increase infiltration, and thus dampen the water energy and volume that comes to Decorah that we're talking about right now. But that's my background in NRCS. Thank you.
Thanks, Dean. I think you're right on target.
I do want to say one more thing. Something came to mind. A question, I believe Michelle asked us about other resources for Dry Run Creek. I believe FEMA did do one study for Dry Run Creek, so you could look at their flood maps that they do. They don't do a specialized study for the area. For example, the Upper Iowa River reach that goes through Decorah, they didn't do a high resolution study, but they do have something there, and so that's a good baseline to use.
Yeah, thanks, Tom.
Thanks.
As I was looking at the map you presented of the 100-year floodplain or 100-year flood event, I took a good hard look at a piece of land that has a lot of solar photovoltaic panels sitting in it. They're going to be floating, I think. But I was also looking at the area of land where Luther's athletic fields are. And it's clear they're going to be affected by flooding. And so I think members of our community need to understand that while the dike has been raised and the berm has been strengthened and I suppose raised, that doesn't mean Luther land is not going to flood. It's just that our buildings are not going to have water, hopefully, encroaching upon them, which is what happened in 2008. And so I think that's important for us to realize as well, is that land is going to soak up some of that flood water. I'm conscious of the time. It's about 6:20. I want to be respectful of our guests, the Woodwell folks living out east. It's getting later in the day for you. Any last questions for the staff at Woodwell and for Dom? Not seeing any. Last chance, folks. Speak up if you got a question.
And we're also, as I said earlier, Jim, we want to continue to be a resource. So if there are, you or anyone else on the call, if there's questions that come up that you just think of, or as you go through the report, please let us know.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dave. And Dom, here, I'm going to give you some applause. And thanks so much for all of your hard work and your team. We appreciate it very, very much. We will need a motion to adjourn from a member of the commission. But before we do that, I just want to get on the commission members' radar screen the possibility that we will have a special meeting in 2 weeks, 2 weeks from today, just to take up some other matters, since we couldn't get after that at this meeting. So I'll be in touch later if in fact we're going to schedule that. I'll work with Chad Bird on that. So do we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Thank you, Molly. A second?
I'll second.
Thank you. I don't know who said that.
Brent?
Brent, thank you, Brent. All in favor? Say aye.
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 Anybody opposed? Okay, great. Thanks again, Dave and Dom and your colleagues. We very much appreciate this. It is really high quality research and we're very grateful for it. And we also appreciate your willingness to be available for further sort of consultation within reason, I realize, right? I mean,
it's our pleasure, and we will follow up, as mentioned, with the geospatial files, and if there's anything else I forgot, I'm sure we have a list going, so we will send that over.
Perfect. All right, friends, thanks very much. Have a great rest of the evening.
Thanks, Jim.
Yep, bye-bye.